Welcome, and thanks for joining us today for a conversation with a most interesting guest. I'm Dick Nations, and it is my extreme pleasure to introduce a veteran of the United States Marine Corps, a commissioned officer who dedicated 29 years of his life to the Corps. Colonel Bob Fischer, U.S. Marine Corps retired. Welcome and thank you for your many years of service to the United States Armed Forces.
Thanks, Dick.
Colonel Fischer, I believe your military career was launched upon acceptance to the United States Naval Academy. What prompted you to pursue a career in the Marine Corps upon graduation?
Well, it's a long story. 1948, two of my friends were in the Naval Reserve, and I'd been on a 1948 All-State basketball team, and they said, "Hands," that was my nickname, "come down and play basketball. We have one of the best basketball teams in the city." And I joined the Naval Reserve, so help me, to play basketball and pitch softball. That was the only reason, because we played on our meeting nights. And I wound up a colonel in the Marine Corps as a result of that, and I got to explain that how that happened, Alpha to Omega. My boss was a commander, PT boat skipper, World War II, saw something in me that I didn't. And I was going to join the Marine Corps the second year that I was in the reserve, and he said, "No," he said, "I'm going to make you an officer. You got a year and a half of college." He said, "I'm going to get you in the Naval Academy." And by God, he did. He managed to get me into Wool Chamberlain Airfield in Minneapolis, 27 weekend meetings, went to a prep school for 7 months for the academy, and I passed the exam and got in. My hometown, Dubuque, was always a Marine Corps town, so I knew when I was going in the Naval Academy that I was going to go in the Marine Corps, because even when I got to the academy, I bought my Marine Corps cap the very first week and put it in my locker. That guaranteed that.
Outstanding. So, following your graduation and commissioning from the Naval Academy, you were ordered to Basic Officers Training Course, I believe. So, how did that experience further prepare you for your military career?
Well, when I graduated in 1955, 2 years after Korea, you can imagine the caliber of officers and seniors, staff NCOs that I had when I got to Marine Corps Officer Training, which is Marine Corps Officer Boot Camp at Quantico, Virginia. And I'm rubbing elbows with the heroes of Iwo Jima, Saipan, Chosin. That was my grooming as a young, brand new second lieutenant at Quantico.
Most interesting, to say the least. So, following your graduation from your Basic Officer Training School, what was your actual first assignment as a United States Marine Corps officer?
3rd Battalion, 4th Marines, Marine Corps Air Station, Kaneohe, Hawaii, where the 4th Marines were located. I reported into the 3rd Battalion to find out my battalion commander is a Navy crosswinder at the Chosin Reservoir, and all 4 company commanders were Silver Star winners. And this brand new second lieutenant was really groomed by some superb officers during that time with the 3rd Battalion, 4th Marines. But Colonel Hull was very interesting in the sense that he had been an OSS officer as a Marine First Lieutenant sent to China to fight with the Chinese guerrillas against the Japanese. And we were surprised to hear, he talked to us lieutenants very often, and he was surprised to hear, he said, "You're not going to fight another Korean War or a World War II, you're going to fight a guerrilla war." And he said, "That's what I fought in China." And he said, "What's looming right now, wars of liberation and the rest," he said, "you'll be fighting a guerrilla war before you fight any other."
Most interesting. So, then your next assignment, I believe, was as a captain of Marine 7th Fleet Flagship that spent most of 61 and 62 in Southeast Asia. Is that correct?
That's correct.
So prior to your entry into Vietnam, you previously stated that this was one of the highlights of your career. How so?
Well, I tell you, when you can be selected to be captain of Marines on the 7th Fleet Flagship as a Marine captain, you're looking at an opportunity that's unbelievable, because we were home ported out of Yokosuka I brought my family with me who lived in Yokohama, but we literally lived most of the time from Taiwan down to Indonesia, Thailand. We went into Vietnam, Philippines, Laos. Couldn't get into Laos, but we were there for that incident. So as captain of the Marines, I had an exceptional tour because with 11 martinis in me one night, when the new captain's reporting in, I challenged him to give my Marines a gun mount. I said, I'll put the first E on your GD mount, sir. And I was told the next day that's what I said. And the captain called me up Monday and into his quarter, and I thought, I'm in for a real reaming at Captain Al Church. And he said, do you remember what you said to me or slurred to me on Saturday night? I said, no, sir. He said, well, you got your GD gun. Now get me an E. So that started the flagship tour. We also won the 7th Fleet Pistol Championship on that tour. And in 61 and 62, we pulled into all the hot spots in Southeast Asia. The ship was actually taken up the Soirap Longtao rivers into Saigon, and that was in 1961. Malaya was the most interesting, where I was able to study the Malaya emergency that was just ending 12 years, and I obtained the syllabus from the Malaya Jungle School, which I would later use in training Marines in counter-guerrilla warfare at Camp Lejeune. Thailand in 1962 was the hottest. It turned out that Vonuan Jop and Ho Chi Minh were sponsoring the Pathet Lao incursion into northeast Thailand at that time, and it was JFK, with the advice of Colonel Brute Krulak, his senior military advisor, who sent the Marine Brigade in from Okinawa, commanded by my future commanding general, Ormond Simpson. And the Marine Brigade went in, and the Pathet Lao retreated hastily, and that was JFK at the same time he was taking Khrushchev on. So that was the beginnings of my learning about and understanding that we had 4 wars of liberation that I was studying firsthand. I managed to get the syllabus from the Malaya Jungle School, the famous Gurkha school that trained all the Australians, New Zealanders, and Brits in counter-guerrilla operations. I managed to get that syllabus that I would use several years later. And I began to learn about guerrilla warfare that few Marines had an exposure to. So I sat down and wrote an article to the Marine Corps Gazette called The Forgotten Subject, in which I stated my premise was, we are unready, totally unprepared, totally untrained to go into any guerrilla war. I don't care if we fought the bandit wars back in the 20s and 30s, these Marines have no idea what this is coming down and what Mao Zedong and Jop have already published, and you can buy their On War and People's War, People's Army of how they built the guerrilla armies, phased it. It's in the Hong Kong and Taiwan libraries to be read, and nobody was reading it. So I wrote The Forgotten Subject, and the editor took one look at it, shoved it back down my throat, and said, you're off base, warped, Marines will never go into that war. The commandant says, we're already trained for any climb in place, all we need is an order to saddle up and go. That's how I left Southeast Asia, with that negative attitude in most of the senior Marine officers at that time. And that's why I wrote my book, Guerrilla Grunt, to outline that same, and I believe you've read it.
Yes. So, Colonel Fischer, it's 1963, and you're transferred to Fort Benning, Georgia. And it was there that you earned your airborne wings. So tell us more about that Fort Benning experience.
Well, when I was coming off the St. Paul, I was not sure where I was going to have duty next, and I decided I think I'd like to get my jump wings, because when I was at the Naval Academy, we didn't have the opportunities they have today to go to airborne school at Fort Benning or wherever. And by gosh, I got orders to Fort Benning, but I got, along with it, I got the Career Infantry School for 9 months, and I got the Nuclear Weapons Employment course as well, and jump school followed all the rest. And while at Benning, we were under the Ranger Department, who did it for our physical training, all 200 of us, and we went through some aspects of the Benning portion of the Ranger School, but nothing like the real Ranger School. Anyway, when I got to Fort Benning, I was surprised to come to my desk the first day. We had 2 to a desk, and I'm sitting there next to a Mustang Captain, Jerry Devlin, who had just come out of the Berlin brawls and confrontations. And Jerry's got the desk all littered with papers, and I said, "What are you doing?" He said, "I'm writing a book." I said, "Wait a minute." He said, "Are you going to go to school?" He said, "Not if I," he said, I don't let my studies interfere with my education." I said, "Okay, I'll spot for you when they call on you." Jerry was writing Paratrooper, which he wrote that year, the famous book Paratrooper.
Interesting.
And Jerry goes to Vietnam right after the course ends. And he's an advisor, like I was, a Covan to the Ranger Battalion, and he was badly injured, badly wounded. He got the Distinguished Service Cross.
Outstanding.
And he was on public television from then on. Whenever you had parachute operations,
Yes.
Normandy and all the Band of Brothers, he was interviewed all the time. He was medically discharged. He did me a favor one day, first week or so we were there, he said, "I want you to meet somebody interesting." And I said, "Okay, let's get on." He said, "Let's go to the mailroom." We get on the mailroom, there's a young second lieutenant, Latino, in a second lieutenant's uniform, Army. He said, "That's Pepe Perez. He led the Bay of Pigs."
So interesting.
And Pepe let us take a 1-hour interview with him if we wouldn't publish a book, because he wrote his own book, Turn Right to Havana. But he didn't pull any punches as to how bad the Bay of Pigs was. And he was bought out by a year after he was in the prison in Cuba, because millions of dollars worth of agricultural equipment were horse traded for the prisoners. So I go to jump school, and you know what that's like. You've only done about 8,000 jumps yourself, but that was a tough one. That was one of my first of my real challenges in the Army schools, and I went to 7 Army schools in the next few years.
Interesting that you had mentioned the nuclear employment weapons course. Those were some very tense times back in that particular era in the early 60s.
That was total top secret, and my sister gets married in one of those weeks, and I'm thinking I'm going to fly to Chicago, and the OIC of the course said, "You're not going anywhere." So I couldn't go to my own sister's wedding in the second week of that school because it was so secret.
Most interesting.
Yeah, we plotted these little circular area probable CEPs all over Europe to counter the Russian assaults with their thousands of tanks and their 10-foot tall Russians. You remember those days were like?
Absolutely.
Okay.
Absolutely. So then 1965 rolls around, and you arrive at Camp Lejeune. 64 in North Carolina, and I assume that your interest in guerrilla warfare increased at that time, and your tireless efforts to train our troops in counterinsurgency doctrine came into fruition. So tell us how that came about.
Well, it was it was all done for me, but I thought I was going to go back to Camp Lejeune, become a company commander, and go on a battalion landing team and go to the Mediterranean or Caribbean for our 6-month cruises. Lo and behold, I report in, and I'm told, "You're going to take your rifle company to Camp Pickett, Virginia, and you're going to be part of a 500-man guerrilla force." And I was under Force Recon at the time. Force Recon Company was our mentors, and we had 2 rifle companies, and one was mine. The executive of the Force Recon found out what I had been learning about guerrilla warfare and all the background I had. He was a classmate of mine in basic school. He said, "We want you to train the guerrilla force." And I trained the guerrilla force for 30 days in the swamps of Camp Lejeune, which is the same darn swamp and jungles that they had at Camp Pickett, where they fired tanks mostly up there.
Yes.
And when we got to Camp Pickett, it was the same thing. So I had pre-trained all those Marines in the Malaya Jungle School, Gurkha guerrilla tactics. We decimated a 2,000-man brigade in 6 days. We did. We knew all the tricks. They knew, and my prediction to the forgotten subject that I wrote, my prediction came true. They didn't have a clue. We pulled every ruse, baited, ambushed, spider traps. We used everything you could use on the guerrilla side. And the commandant comes down and terminates a 10-day exercise in 6 days, and he pulls me up and says, tell him how you did it. And I look at him and said, that's the end of my career. And he points to his 4 stars and he says, I don't think so.
Oh, goodness.
So I debriefed the brigade commander and the 2 battalion staffs on how we did it. And by the time I got back to Lejeune, I was a marked man, so that's how I wound up in Fort Bragg so often. As I told you, I went to the Special Forces schools and counterinsurgency school. My boss sent me out of town because I was marked. You don't defeat a brigade of Marines when you're a bunch of ragtag guerrillas, but we made the point. So at Bragg, I wrote the proposal for the counter-guerrilla warfare school that would eventually be set up at Camp Lejeune. But before that, I went on a deployment. I finally went on BLT with my company. I was at Dominican Republic, Cuba, and Panama. Those were our experiences. And survived all that. It was kind of real mayhem in some spots. But anyway, by the time I got back to Lejeune, it was March 1965, and the Assistant Commandant of the Marine Corps is visiting and says, where's your counter-guerrilla training program? Well, it had been laying up there for months, gathering dust at division, and I'm ordered up the next day to start the Counter-Guerrilla Warfare Center at Camp Lejeune. And it's actually the most authentic counter-guerrilla center that you could find in the United States at the time. The French officers came. Malcolm Brown did a book on our booby trap trails, and we were very, very well visited. Now, that center, before I left it, that center trained 20,000 Marines in a year and a half. Half a dozen Navy SEAL teams and Special Forces teams came and also attended.
My goodness. So, Colonel, in 1966, you returned to Vietnam as an advisor to the Vietnamese Marine Corps. So, would you describe that particular experience for us?
Well, about everything that ever happened to me, Dick, is an incident or an experience that I just am dumbfounded at, because when I got back from overseas on this flagship, it was summer of '63, and my monitor told me, well, you're not going to go back right away. I was trying to go back to Vietnam maybe in a year or so. No, you're not going to get back for a while. I said, well, how do I get over there? He said, well, you'd have to volunteer to be an advisor. And I said, well, I'm volunteering. And the next thing I know, when my time's up in the fall of '66, I get orders from my monitor that predate what my orders to Vietnam as an advisor. I had to turn down being military officer instructor at Notre Dame University and travel with the famous football team even. That's what the Marine officer did. Anyway, I did get my orders in '66 and reported in to become a Vietnamese Marine advisor, one of the 300 who became advisors in a period of 12 years. And like I said, well, I haven't said yet, but being an advisor was quite an experience, because you go live in the Vietnamese Marines, Airborne, and Ranger. We lived in the villages. We were 80% of the time in the field. I had 4 major operations that were initially first amphibious landing in the Delta, Deckhouse 5 in Quinhua Province, then Junction City with the 173rd, Big Red 1, Marical, all of them, 30,000 of us up plowing the jungles in Tay Ninh looking for the central office of Vietnam, the COSVIN headquarters, which nobody found. And then after that, we go into the Rung Sat Special Zone for 90 days, and that's where I told you how much I idolize and respect those young Army warrant officer pilots I got, because they would fly the 100 feet, 80 knots, and we knocked out a lot of Phuong camps at that. But then my final 5 months was with the Air Cav in Bongsan, and that's another great experience, because I think I told you that I started in Fort Benning with the 11th Air Assault, and I used to go to church with Hal Moore and his officers, and I watched the 11th Air Assault become the Air Cav.
Interesting.
And of all places, that's how many experiences I had that were just coincidental. I can't believe. But anyway, by the time I got to Nam, I wound up a task force advisor, and we had 4 major operations. And when you earned your spurs, after about 6 months, you were given the title Kovan, which is what my 8th book is titled right now, Memories of a Marine Advisor. And what we were is we were support. The Vietnamese Marine officers were discovered by my friend Colonel Croizat when they partitioned the two Vietnams. He saw the famous French Dinosaurs, the French boat commandos, and he saw what appeared to be about a battalion, several companies of these commandos, Vietnamese. They were Catholic and Buddhist, so they had to come south in the partitioning. He turned them into the 1st Vietnamese Marine Corps Battalion at Nha Trang, and he was the first advisor. I came years later, about 10 years later, to be an advisor. Anyway, we brought our officers and senior NCOs back to the States and integrated them with our Marine companies, Marine Corps schools. So did the Airborne, your Vietnamese Marine Airborne, and the Rangers did much of the same. That's why they became elite Vietnamese troops. There were some good ARVN or divisions and units, but in the majority, the ARVN was cooped up in defensive positions and were never allowed to integrate, which is one of the things I'll talk about in the lessons learned.
Colonel, over the years since the Vietnam War, have you had any further communications with the Vietnamese Marine Corps officers that
Yes,
you were advised?
Yes, up until a few years ago, we've had, most of them have died now. I'm going on 91, so you can imagine that I was junior to some of those officers. My counterpart, Colonel Swan, who was an unbelievable field commander, I like to tell a little story about him. Colonel Swan was always his point for his task force. And we're in Bong Son, and we're sweeping these villages, into these villages. We're out 100 yards ahead of everybody else. And it's me and the colonel and 2 radio operators. And I turn to him, he comes up to my shoulder, about shorter guy, and I said, "Colonel, you make a hell of a target." He looked at me and said, "No, you do." But that's the kind of rapport that we had to get with and then we provided medevac, we provided any kind of supply, logistic lifts, naval gunfire coordination, airstrikes, the whole bit. That's what we were there for, is to support them. But back to their training, they were superb in the field. There was no way I was going to train any of those officers or company commanders to be any better than they were going to be.
Outstanding.
But we didn't do it with the ARVN. We never integrated the ARVN, Army of Vietnam.
Certainly. So later in your career, 10 years after Vietnam, you're assigned as a lecturer at the Naval War College. So what was your specialty there?
Counterinsurgency.
Everything that you had practiced and written on and promoted.
Well, it was an accident of fate anyway. Another one of those accidents. I'd gone there as a student, basically, at the War College, and the admiral, for some reason, was screening all records and found out my background in counter-guerrilla warfare, counterinsurgency, and all that. And next thing, I'm in his office, and he said, the foreign students, about 50 to 60 foreign students, want a presentation and seminar on Vietnam, on guerrilla warfare and counterinsurgency, and you're it. And that's how I wound up becoming the adjunct professor at the moment for that particular course that lasted several sessions, a couple of lectures and then the seminar course. And that's how that happened.
Outstanding. So, Colonel, over the years, there's been a vast amount of propaganda about the Vietnam War. And as a commissioned officer who had feet on the ground there, summarize for us your thoughts about the Vietnam War.
Well, as a friend of mine, General Paul Van Riper, who was both a company commander at Lejeune with me and an advisor in Vietnam with the Vietnamese Marines, he stated when he was head of the Naval War College, it was the wrong war, the wrong place, the wrong time, and it also applies to Iraq freedom and Afghanistan. The Vietnam War was a people's war, as I mentioned to you earlier. Both Mao Zedong in his On War that he wrote, and Giap, who wrote People's War, People's Army, and it had the 3 phases of insurgency, building the local guerrillas, then building the guerrilla battalions, and then phasing into the conventional level where the North Vietnamese Popular Army became the big forces at Khe Sanh, and where they stood and fight, and Nha Drang. We didn't learn anything. Nobody read those, but worse, when the French were defeated in 1954, finally. Now you're talking about a modern army, the French army is defeated by the Vietnamese. Ho Chi Minh, and then at Dien Bien Phu, by guerrilla armies. They wrote a classic that my friend Colonel Croizet translated, because he went to École Supérieure de Guerre in Paris, Napoleon School. He was born French, and he spoke French, and he was President Diem's interpreter. General O'Daniel, who was head of the MAG, 1954, 55, Saigon, said he wanted it translated, but General O'Daniel never stopped to read it. It's called The French Lessons of the War in Indochina. And it's amazing the admission the French gave of how they lost the war. And they told all the things that we should have learned about fighting guerrilla armies and how the guerrillas worked and everything else. General Westmoreland was presented the book in 1964-65 by Colonel Croizet, who was there again with the MAG. And he said, what can the French teach us? They lost. And that was, so nobody read the French, and I have a copy of the French Lessons Learned translated in my home, but I also saw the original French copy on Victor's desk in Santa Monica when I visited him years later.
Most interesting.
And we didn't learn one thing from the French. In the movie, we were soldiers. Mel Gibson, playing Colonel Hal Moore, is looking at the French lessons learned on his floor of the videos of the ambushes and everything. That's what he's got laid out.
So interesting.
Is the French lessons learned. And I recognize it because I know what was in it. Anyway, wrong place, wrong time, wrong whatever. It was a protracted war of attrition. We couldn't have had a worse strategy for that war. Body count. Right out of World War II, attrition warfare, kill all those Germans, kill all those Japanese, kill all those Vietnamese. Wait a minute, these are the people of Vietnam, and we're coming in to kill their kids who happen to be Viet Cong too. And so racking up body count, 58,000, we traded 58,000 for probably 500,000 to 1 million North Vietnamese. That's one of the most inane strategies we could have ever gone in with when the Marine Corps developed the Combined Action Program, where we began to put squads of Marines and platoons in the villages, 150 villages that denied recruitment of the Viet Cong. It allowed them to raise their crops, and they were prosperous. And the CAP program worked for a couple of years, and I knew the colonel from Hong Kong days that started it, Bill Corson. And it was very popular, but it used up the resources of the Marine Corps to have, we just couldn't fight the North Vietnamese and still put that many people out, so it capped off at that time. But it would have been, according to General Krulak, who was the aide to President Kennedy, it would have been the solution to the war had we started right in the beginning and trained the ARVN to go back into those villages and become those combined action. That would have been the best strategy.
So interesting.
And then we have everyone that went into the war was World War II and Korea training, as I mentioned,
Correct.
And they had to learn on the spot. That was bad. We veterans took the blame, as I point out in my book, Echoes of Our War. We took the blame for 20 to 30 years for
Yes.
the war, and yet we went in under the Southeast Asia Treaty that was signed in 1955-56, but prostituted by McNamara and Johnson with the false cause of the war that was outlined in the Pentagon Papers, which I'm not going to go into, but there was a legitimate reason to go there. We went into Korea under a treaty, and we went into South Vietnam also, where the brigade under John Kennedy sent into Thailand. That was under Southeast Asia Treaty. A lot of people forget that too.
So true, so true.
Okay. Oh, I have to mention one other. Thank you for one other incident. 1995, 1996. 30 years after my experience in Vietnam, I went to a VFW, and I won't mention the state or the city, and I had my Vietnam cap on, and I was told I couldn't come in because you lost your war. That's how we were treated.
What an insult. What an insult. Well, Colonel Fischer, I'm very grateful that you accepted our invitation to reflect back on your distinguished military career. There are so many stories yet to be told by veterans that be lost as time passes. They're not captured. And from those stories, there are still yet lessons to be learned. So, through your observation and your enterprising initiative, you were at the forefront in helping to change the way Marines fight their wars, beginning with Vietnam, later in Iraq and Afghanistan, by employing the modern counterinsurgery tactical doctrine. And no doubt your contribution helped save lives. And for that, we shall be forever grateful, and you should be commended. Thank you very much for your contribution.
Thank you.
So, following his retirement from the Marine Corps, Colonel Fischer has remained an advocate for our treasured veterans. His time is devoted to the Rocky Mountain Hyperbaric Clinic in Louisville, Colorado, where wounded warriors suffering from traumatic brain injury and post-traumatic stress disorder are treated and healed. He is an ultra-strong advocate for supporting our veterans. And furthermore, Colonel Fischer has authored now 8 books. The more recent publication that has just hit the bookstores was released early this year in 2021, and it's entitled Echoes of Our War. It's truly a fascinating read which summarizes the individual experiences of 10 Marines who served in Vietnam. I strongly encourage that you get a copy of the book and you'll better understand their perspective of the war from combatants with feet on the ground. Again, Echoes of Our War, and today that is now available through Amazon and through virtually any major bookstore chain, Barnes & Noble included. Colonel, it's been a pleasure visiting with you today, and we thank you for sharing, we thank you for serving, and we thank you for supporting our veterans.
Thank you for the great interview.
Thank you, sir.